Hello, everyone. I'm Caroline McHutchinson, and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Stirling. In this presentation today, I'm going to talk about my research, which looks at difficulties with thinking, which we refer to as cognition, and changes in behaviour that people living with motor neuron disease can experience. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what we know about cognition and behaviour in MND, and then I'm going to share some of my own research that's currently ongoing.
Although it was originally thought that motor neuron disease only affected people physically, we now know that some people living with MND also experience difficulties with their cognition or changes in their behavior. Some examples of the types of cognitive difficulties that we see are things such as people finding it difficult to make plans or make decisions. Other people might find it challenging to understand how other people are feeling or what they're thinking. And we refer to these collectively as executive functions. Some people, however, might find it difficult with their language functions. So they might find it hard to find the correct words when they're talking or communicating, but they might find it challenging to also name items or objects that they were previously able to name. In terms of behavior, the most common type of behavior change that we see is apathy, and that's this loss of motivation or drive. And this may look like someone who is not contacting their friends or family as often as they previously did, or perhaps they're becoming more easily distracted. We do see other types of behavior change in MND, and this might include things such as socially inappropriate behavior, so a loss of manners. But other people experience changes in terms of the types of foods they want to eat. In particular, they may start to crave more sweet food. Now, not everyone living with motor neuron disease will experience these difficulties in cognition or changes in their behavior. And for most who do, they will be relatively mild. But in around 10 to 15% of people with MND, these symptoms are quite severe, and they meet the diagnostic criteria for a very specific type of dementia called frontal temporal dementia, or FTD for short. And it's really important that we consider these symptoms in MND because they may impact someone's ability to make decisions about their treatment or their care, but they can also be quite distressing, not just for the person with MND, but also for their family members and friends. Now, we know a lot about the types of cognitive difficulties and the types of behavior change that people living with MND can experience. But I was really interested in looking at how these symptoms change over time. So, as the disease progresses, does cognition worsen? And do people start to experience more behavioral symptoms? So, we looked at this using data from the CREATE study. And this was done in collaboration with researchers from the University of Miami and the University of Edinburgh. And CREATE includes people from North America who have a diagnosis of MND. When they come into the study, they complete a number of different measures, including a cognitive measure, which is the Edinburgh Cognitive and Behavioural ALS stream, or the ECAS for short. The ECAS was developed specifically for people living with MND. And that means that someone can complete it either verbally or in writing, depending on what they're most comfortable with. It's also nice and brief, so it takes about 20 minutes to complete, and it taps into all of those cognitive functions that we know can be affected in MND. So that's those executive functions and language functions that we talked about earlier. And although the ECAS was developed in the UK, it has been translated and culturally adapted into many different languages. And so here we use the North American English version. And we can see the first page here, which has the language of the naming test. We also collected information on the behaviour symptoms, and we did this using the behavioural interview, which is part of the ECAS. So we collect this information from someone who knows the person living with MND well. So that might be a family member, a friend, or a caregiver. And they just share their observations of any behavior change that they've noticed. Sometimes we can find that it's really difficult to recognize behavior changes in ourselves. So getting that perspective of someone who knows that person well can be really helpful for it. So in Create, people came into the study and they completed different versions of this cognitive assessment and the behavioral interview every 3 to 6 months. And they did this for up to 5 visits. So in the end, we had around 237 people with MND who had completed the cognitive and behavioral part of the ECAS at 3 or more visits. And we could then use this data to see whether scores on the cognitive component changed over time or whether the number of behavior symptoms changed over time. And so here's what we found. So for cognition, we found that most people with MND didn't show any cognitive difficulties at their first assessment, and they stayed relatively stable over time. So we can see that here with this green and this blue line at the top. However, we did find that a small proportion of people with MND had cognitive difficulties when they first came into the study. So we can see the slightly lower point for the yellow line. And these scores decreased over time. And so that shows to us that their cognition was worsening. We were really interested in whether a specific genetic signature, the C9orf72, was associated with this type of cognitive trajectory. And what we found was that although some people in this group did carry that genetic signature, not everyone did. And so that told us that there must be other factors that put people at an increased risk of this cognitive decline. For behaviour, we found that around 50% of people with MND experienced at least one behaviour symptom at some point in the study. And we can see that the highest bars on this plot here are these sort of browny green bars. And this shows us that at each of the visits, apathy was the most common behaviour symptom. So that's this loss of drive or motivation. But one thing that we did find was that the number of behaviour symptoms that people experienced really fluctuated over time. And that's something that we're hoping to explore more. I'm going to talk about in more detail later. But one thing that we really noticed in this study is that at this first time point, there are some people who already have cognitive difficulties or already have behavioural symptoms. And so this indicated to us that these people must be experiencing these symptoms either very on in their diagnosis or perhaps even earlier. So if we think about how motor neuron disease develops, it's likely that there is this initial stage where there are no signs or symptoms that we can see to indicate that MND has begun. This might then be followed by a second stage where we start to see very mild signs or symptoms. So perhaps the person has noticed some very mild weakness, or perhaps we can see something on testing, but it's not severe enough to indicate MND. So this might be a very early stage of the disease. And often we hear this period here before the diagnosis of MND referred to as pre-symptomatic period. And now that we know that there are certain genetic signatures that increase people's risk of developing MND, we can study this phase of the disease. We can recruit people who have a genetic risk of MND and follow them up to see what sort of early mild symptoms they develop. And this is really important because if we can identify these really early symptoms of the disease, we can target people for clinical trials to try to find treatments or therapies that can slow down the progression of the disease. So my current work is looking at whether people experience cognitive and behavioural symptoms during this period, and if so, how can we identify them? So we're doing this using data from the pre-symptomatic familial ALS study, or pre-FALS for short. And this is another collaborative project between researchers at Miami, Edinburgh, and Stirling. So pre-FALS first began in 2007, and it's an ongoing study. And they recruit people from across North America who have a genetic risk of developing MND. Researchers see these people every 1 to 3 years, and they complete a number of different tests, which include tests of cognition, such as the ECAS, but they also include a very comprehensive neuropsychological battery. So these are cognitive tests that take around 2 hours collectively to complete. And we're also collecting the behavioural information using questionnaires and the interview with a family member or friend. So we can now use this data to see when cognitive symptoms first begin, what are those cognitive symptoms, and can we identify people experiencing these cognitive symptoms? And we're working on developing a criteria that we can use in research so that we can say, yes, these individuals have mild cognitive impairment. And that might indicate an early stage of the disease. So I mentioned earlier in terms of the behaviour symptoms that it was really difficult for us to understand how these were developing over time. And so one of the reasons that we found this difficult to understand was because many of the tools that we have available to us don't capture a lot of the details that we need to fully understand how they change. So we've been working to develop an updated measure of the behavioural interview that goes along with the ECAS. And we really want to capture details such as when a behaviour symptom occurs, is that a new behavior that that individual has never shown before in the past? Or perhaps it is something that we might consider a long-standing trait that has become more pronounced or it's worsened. We're also interested in capturing more information about how behavior symptoms change. So, for example, we might be interested in whether some people experience symptoms of loss of manners as an initial symptom, and that later turns into apathy, which develops later. But we're also interested in whether some behaviors perhaps increase in how frequent they occur as the disease progresses, or do they become more severe? So are they having a greater impact on those around them? We're also looking at different things such as the types of measures that people might take to help minimize the impact of these behavior symptoms. And so we're using this new measure to collect data from people who are at genetic risk of MND, but also people living with MND. And this will allow us to see just how behavior symptoms develop and change over the entire course of the disease. So just to conclude with sort of the research that we've been looking at so far. So we looked at people living with MND to see how cognition changed over time. And we found a small proportion of people had cognitive difficulties when they first came into the study, and these worsened over time. It showed us that people had these cognitive difficulties when they first came into the study, which suggests that they may have occurred really early on in the process of MND. So we're currently looking to see whether people experience cognitive difficulties in an early phase of the disease and developing criteria to help us identify them. We're also doing a lot of work to try to understand these behavior symptoms better. And so we're gathering more in-depth information using our new measure, the extended ECAS behavioral interview. So, of course, none of this research would be possible without the participants in both the CREATE and the pre-FAL study, and also the collaborators who work on this project. So, in particular, Professor Sharon Abrahams from the University of Edinburgh and Professor Michael Benatar and Joanne Wu from the University of Miami. And there are a number of people who work on these studies at the site in the University of Miami. I'd also like to thank MND Scotland as well, just for this opportunity to talk about my research and share some of the things that we're finding. providing. Thank you.